Eulalia! Good evening, or whatever time it happens to be for you, dear friends, dear foes. Um, I have finished Mariel of Redwall. Good read, but given how I remember it, not as good as I remember. I remember Mariel being one of my favorites when I was a kid, and I'll get to why that is in a bit. And this time I will get to it. But let me think. There were a whole bunch of things about this one that were rough. And I guess the best place to start, quick summary. Redwall's a bit rough around the edges generally, but it's got a good story. It knows what it wants to do more or less. And it's really just the execution of it where it needs work. It has a decent start as well. Mossflower has pretty solid start. And with the exception of a couple places where it falters and feels weak, it ends up being a very strong story, even with a mostly strong middle. And of course, a rather powerful end. Mattimeo has a very weak middle, but a fabulous opening and a fabulous end, which help make it a pretty strong entry. And the current ranking I have is Mossflower at the top, Mattimeo below it, and Redwall in last. And Redwall in last purely because of quality of work, of technical quality, rather than quality of the story. Mariel is, when added to that ranking, in third place because it is the only book I've read thus far out of Jakes' work that has a weak opening. What I mean by that is Jakes is trying a few things, and they don't all land. Jakes is dipping into the psychological effects of warfare, which is not a bad place to go. It's an interesting area to explore, though may not be right for a children's series, which Redwall definitely is. But it's interesting, and I'd say even admirable that he goes there. However, he does not handle it well. He clearly tried, but a lot of the time it falls flat or even just really off. And it's not to say that mental exploration of psyche in children's literature can't work. I've actually got a really solid example of that that I'll share once I've gone through what Mariel does poorly. But yeah, let's just get into the sort of nitty gritty details. I've got this wonderful sword bookmark that I've been using. It resembles somewhat the Sword of Martin, and so I like it for that. I haven't quite started Salamandastron, but I will be doing so shortly. Let's see. Okay. Mariel is an amnesiac, initially. She gets... The story basically goes that she was serving in Gabul's castle... Gabul... I've already forgotten what Gabul's epithet is. Is Gabul the Scourge? Gabul the Cruel? Something like that. Gabul, which he's a pretty solid villain, though not as good as either Sarmina or actually I think he's the weakest villain we've had. He's a fun villain. He's a very fun villain, but he's I think the least interesting, really. We don't really get any indication of his background except at a couple points, and it's not really explored. And he mostly just sort of sits in one place until trouble comes to him. Which could be an interesting sort of villain, but he's not demonstrated to be dangerous enough that his death feels all that impactful. Got a whole bunch of people who hate his guts because he's messed with them in some way, but we don't see him messing around enough to really care. Anyway, that tangent over. Mariel, she's in Gabul's castle. She's a strong-headed young lass. She manages to whack him pretty hard in a fight that she accidentally gets herself into, and then she's thrown off a cliff. And between the seawater and the getting bonked on the head, she loses her memory. It's not a bad start. It's actually kind of interesting, except her amnesia is not handled well. She seems to understand most basic concepts, except for some reason play. Like when she arrives at Redwall, she doesn't understand the concept of sports or games. She's very good with her rope weapon right off the bat. That's not a bad thing necessarily. Um, I'm not one to criticize when someone is naturally good with something that works. I think the worst character trait is being immediately liked by everyone, which is a trait that Mariel doesn't really have. Um, that was more an issue with Matthias in Redwall, but not really one that Mariel exhibits. Luckily, it's actually one of her saving graces. Um, but Mariel switches to being her amnesia feels like it switches from being like barely consequential to being almost used for comedic effect to being utterly crippling, more or less at the author's attempt. Or I'm not sure what Jakes was going for with it. That's part of the issue is that it doesn't have a consistent tone or a consistent purpose, except that it sort of conceals her name, but very, very poorly, given that her name is on the cover. And Storm Gullwhacker is pretty obviously our protagonist from Square One. Um, and then once her amnesia is taken care of, it never comes up again. Except in like one point where like when the hares reach the abbey and they remark, "Oh, that Storm Gullwhacker girl had a much prettier name," and it's like that's the only time it's referenced. Um, so it feels like could have been more impactful, could have been better used. There's also like one point at the very beginning of the journey, like the actual quest that they go on, one point where Mariel like has a flash of almost PTSD, and that felt out of place, and it never shows up again. And there's a couple of points where Saxtus, who's one of the mice at the Abbey, is and Saxtus really doesn't seem as important as he really should be. He's rather good at the start, and then sort of falls into this character of, "Oh no, we're killing people, and I'm scared." And then one of the otters, or one of the hares, steps over and points out, "Dude, we're fighting sea rats. We kind of have to kill them, unfortunately." Um, the hares are actually really solid. Like the Long Patrol, which I think this is the first time they're actually called out as the Long Patrol. Because in Mossflower, I think it's in Mattimeo, Basil Staghare was out on a long patrol and then comes back. But it's not references him being a member of the Long Patrol. Um, yeah, funky. Once again, Jakes actually has some really good fight scenes. He's got some good setup. He's got some good food throughout. But the characters in this one feel like a step down. Not the main party. The main party actually feels very balanced. Mariel is very headstrong and wants to fight everything. Dandon, despite having the sort of Martin, is the cool-headed one, though not without his faults. Young Dury Quill sort of just along for the ride and wants to do something with his life before he settles down, and so he ends up being largely comic relief, but not in a bad way. And then Tarquin ends up being physical competency, a decent amount of know-how, and a decent amount of comic relief. And it ends up feeling like a very balanced party. There isn't anything that feels out of the way. And this is also the first time where we've had a hedgehog be in like an actual main character of the party, since Jabez Spike in Mattimeo wasn't all that everywhere. He was present, but he wasn't like actually active in most things. Dury is active, and I like that. Um, Gabul has some great descriptions associated with him. The gold teeth with the emeralds in them is a very powerful image. I feel like there could have been more done with the pirate ships. I feel like there could have been a lot more done with the sea rats. It almost feels like there are like 2 or 3 different stories here. Um, like we could have had a whole story exploring Joseph's um, survival and survival and his founding of the rebellion, because he appears for a few chapters and gets chucked out a window, and then he appears in like the last 10 as an almost Deus Ex to free the ore slaves and like help in the attack. And I believe, let me double check here. That's right. There is the Bellmaker is the 7th book. And so maybe that'll explore. I don't think it does. I forget. I don't remember the Bellmaker. That was one of the ones that was like I always forget it. I'll let you read it though. And it's coming up not too far away. It's like in 3 books. So, oh well. I do have Salomon Dastron with me. I just haven't like dove into it yet. I always thought Martin the Warrior came before Salomon Dastron, but apparently it's the other way around. Might have been how I read them initially. Yeah. Uh, the the opening is weak mainly because of Mariel. Mariel ends up being a really strong character by the middle and end of the book. And the thing about Mariel is it's got a decent middle. It's got a really weak start though because of the amnesia plot and the fact that most of the sea rats have no payoff and really no characterization. Like there are a couple of rats that have like exactly 2 lines. The line where their name is mentioned and the line where they are unceremoniously killed. Or there was one point where introduced and killed on the same line. And then like 3 lines later called out as like oh no, they killed so and so. Those lines could have been omitted entirely. Or even just kept the they killed so and so line without the calling his name out in the previous line. It's like, I do like Jake's ship names. As with many things, Jake's is great at building a world, and the places where he is failing is in the technical side of plotting and like execution of arcs, which is the harder part of writing. I will, freely admit. That's what's kept me from getting a lot of my own stuff fully worked out. Is I always feel like I need more plot, and part of that's me being a perfectionist. Part of that's me being a planner, really. When I think I could honestly, I think a lot of it's procrastination, pretending to be planning. Yeah, I'll get over it at some point, I'm sure. Packatug is a character that appears a few times, is a bit of a miserable creature, but comes around by the end and then he dies. Squirrels in this book are actually just, in general, kind of eh. Tree Rose is whiny and seems rather spoiled until she isn't. Roof Brush is fine, except that I always forget he's a squirrel. Like, I always think Roof Brush, despite his name, is like an otter or something. Because he acts more like an otter than a squirrel, but apparently he's a squirrel. And then Oak Tom appears at the end and has incredibly inconsistent characterization. He, like, shows up as this fat, jolly fellow that left a couple seasons back and is, coming over to see friends and eat food. And then he apparently spends the next week creeping through the forests, picking off stray rats. it just feels very annoying. Um, Grey Patch's sieging of the Abbey could have either just. I hate to say it, but I almost wish it wasn't part of the story. Like, I almost wish that we had very little of Redwall, or that some other subplot happened. Because Grey Patch's attack feels like a smaller scale version of Clooney's, to be honest. Um, Down to the, using various creative ways of attack and them all failing. Um, though, admittedly, if we didn't have Grey Patch's battle with the Abbey, we wouldn't have nearly as much of Bag Run and Grub. Bag and Run and Grub. Bag and Run are a couple of otters. Grub is a mole. They're the Dibbons. This is, I think, the second book. This is either the first or second book where Dibbons are mentioned as Dibbons. And I think this is the first time they're mentioned specifically as being Dibbons. Mattimeo was the first time. Eulalia, this is the first time Eulalia is associated specifically with Salamandastron and the Hares and the Badger Lords. It was only Orlando's war cry in Mattimeo. But the Dibbons, as the name for the Abbey youngsters, appears here first, and I'm very fond of the term. And Bag, Run, and Grub are, I think, my favorite like comedic small character that we've encountered so far. Cheek was pretty good. And I think it was Chib in Mossflower along with the two hedgehogs. But Bag and Run and Grub are just really fun, and they don't feel intrusive. That's the amazing thing, is that like they don't feel like they overstay their welcome. There's always Mama Melis or one of the others to rein them in. And it feels especially good because Bag and Run feel like they feel like they're older kids, but not quite teenagers, and not quite a good ways still from adulthood, but they're on the older end of kid. And Grub feels much like a toddler, so it feels like a couple of like 8 or 9 year olds, and then like a 5 or 6 year old following along with them. And it works, and it feels strong, and they're cheerful together, and they eat all sorts of foods and cause chaos. And it's just they feel like they're fun. They're fun, and they provide a lot of needed levity, while also being not entirely useless to the story. They often advance things more than they delay. It's not like Rollo, where they constantly need to be saved, for example. Here's an odd point. The main character is kind of unclear for a lot of it. Like Dandon and Mariel both have a lot of like protagonist feeling about them. And Mariel's the protagonist, I think. But I think had Jake's been a bit more of an advanced writer, he might have written it as a dual protagonist sort of a thing. And I think it's almost like that. And part of that's because they both get Spirit of Martin the most, and I think about equal proportion. Everybody gets Spirit of Martin in this one. Like, good lord, if I thought Mattimeo was heavy on Spirit of Martin, Mariel trumps it hard. Not a bad thing, but like Simeon gets it, and Saxtus gets it, and Dandon and Mariel, and even Lord Ronblade at one point. Though it feels pretty natural with him. Here's one thing I did like a lot was Gabul, as he's waiting for Grey Patch to be delivered to him, which never happens, of course, because he gets killed out at Redwall. But Gabul, um, Gabul has this creature trapped in a pit, and it's not really clear what sort of a thing it is. It's like, is this an eel? Like longfish was, I think it was in Mossflower. Is this some other creature? And then later, it's like mentioned as an arachnid, and I think, ooh, a spider. But then at the end, it's revealed it's a scorpion, which is an arachnid. Um, and it's this quick little fight, but it's this beautiful reveal right at the end, and it feels appropriate that evil fights that evil gets destroyed by basically hubris. Hoist by his own petard, as it will, though it's on the end of a scorpion stinger. So, hoist by his own stinger. But then the scorpion gets killed, and it all works out. And that works out especially well because everybody wanted to kill Gabul. And so we've got this great Gabul versus everyone fight where everyone's pitching in at least a little bit, or attempting to. And then it ends up with Gabul being, killed by the scorpion. Though the scorpion very nearly got Ronblade, and that again felt like that it gave Gabul a bit of credit right at the end, when theoretically he shouldn't need it, but he actually needed the credit, the credibility as a villain, and so it felt okay. Um, Really, the I can't help but feel Mattimeo disappointed me because of how many plot holes it had, especially glaring ones. Mariel, it just feels like a step down, which surprised me because I remember it being really fun, and I remembered it being, one of the ones I consider my favorites. And I think that boils down to that Mariel is an engaging character. Um, she's headstrong. She's rather fearsome. She tends a lot more towards violence than the other creatures in the story, even the hares to some degree. Um, but she's tough and she, fights people. And I think at the mental side of things, been better. This would easily be top of my list. Um, I almost think that had the amnesia been cut entirely and it was just Mariel annoyed waking up on a beach, would have been better. Yeah. I wish I could say more good things about this. But most of the good things I would say would mostly be parroting things I've said with the other books. That the food has beautiful the environments and food and a whole bunch of other things have vibrant descriptions. I think Terramort's a pretty interesting location that we don't get anywhere near enough time to explore. Like there's this. It's revealed in like the last few chapters that there's this big network of caves under Terramort, and we had no indication of that before. We don't really get a good feeling for the island, just for Fort Bladegirt. And even Fort Bladegert's physical description is a little lacking, I think, because it wasn't until I was like going through the battle plan, that I realized, oh, this isn't just a tower. This is a tower with like a curtain wall and a courtyard, um, and presumably little watchtowers and whatnot. Um, uh, the, the, it almost feels rushed. It almost feels like a first draft that needed more editing. And I get the sense that it wasn't because there aren't. I didn't notice any like technical flaws like misplaced commas or obvious typos or whatever. And I caught a few of those in the first Redwall novel. Didn't catch any here, so either Jake's the perfect writer, which never happens, or I feel like he needed a good developmental editor, and he didn't have one, or he wasn't able to work with one. whatever. Character highlights. Clary and the Hares are pretty solid. Um, but I think the award goes to Bobo. Bobo and Furl. Bobo is this fat dormouse that they meet towards the end of their journey. He ends up spotting the wreck of the Green Fang, I believe is the name it's given by the rats. Um, but he's this fat old dormouse who lives in a bunch of rocks. He has a cave and he makes himself stew, and he's got his little waistcoat, and he um, just sort of lives by himself. And so he's very hospitable to Mariel and her company when they meet him. Um, and I guess the thing that bothers me most about the whole thing is, like with Mattimeo, how did the rhyme know about the compass bird at the bottom of the pool? And that's actually the weirdly specific prophetic rhymes is something that Jakes has been doing a bit. And it made sense for some of them, like Redwall's made some sense, but the others not as much. And so, yeah. Let me see if there's anything I missed. Yeah, there's a lot of things that feel like they aren't set up properly or aren't paid off well. Like the pirate ships in general. Um, like the pirate ships and their locations and how long they'll be all out and all that feels like it's going to be important at the start because of what Gabul mentions about it. But it ends up not being all that important at the end. Except that like there's this little moment where Mariel and Tarquin manage to trick the other ships by pretending to be sea rats from a distance while Rod and Blade hide in the doors. And that was a great moment. Ron Blade is actually a really solid character because he feels like a capable commander, but also just a great warrior. And so he's strong. Very strong. The bell as a foil to Gabul is a nice element that again I feel there could have been more done with. I guess that really does sum it up. Mariel feels like a book where more could have been done, but wasn't. And so that puts me a little apprehensive for Salamandastron. But I'm confident that Jakes will, get better. I think to some degree Mattimeo he had the advantage because he was writing a sequel. And so Mariel was a prequel, but not as far back as Mossflower. So he had a much more difficult balancing act to play with. But I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to Salamandastron. Mariel's in third place thus far. Better than the original, but not as good as either Mattimeo or Mossflower. I'll catch you all next time one of these comes up. Probably in around a week, maybe later. Maybe a little later. Yeah, I can't think of much more else to say. Valete.